Russia says it has downed several Ukrainian drones overnight. One drone was reportedly intercepted close to Moscow and at least 2 more over the southern Rostov region. It comes as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken continues a 2-day visit to Kyiv, during which he announced a new aid package of more than $1 billion for Ukraine. Just hours before the US announcement, 17 people were killed in a Russian missile strike on a crowded market in eastern Ukraine. Another 32 people were wounded. And just a warning, you might find some of the images disturbing in Paul Adams' report that's coming up.
Close to Ukraine's eastern front lines, death falls from the sky without warning. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a row of shops in the town of Konstantinivka. They're used to attacks here, but not on this scale. In the blast's shocking aftermath, a search for the living and the dead. It's not immediately clear what kind of weapon landed here, but shrapnel tore into the road, into cars and people.
This is a civilian pharmacy. At the time of the strike, civilians were here, buying medicines, and this is what happened.
Ukraine's president, as he has so many times before, sounded outraged.
Ми розуміємо, що вони роблять, те саме, що і було раніше, коли відбуваються ті чи інші.
We understand what they are doing. They did the same in the past. Whenever there is any positive offensive step by Ukraine's defence forces, Russia targets civilians and civilian infrastructure.
This was one of the worst attacks on Ukrainian civilians since the spring, and it came as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was here in Kyiv pledging yet more support. President Zelensky, fresh from visiting troops at the front, gave his visitor a positive account of Ukraine's recent advances.
In the ongoing counteroffensive, progress has accelerated in the past few weeks. This new assistance will help sustain it and build further momentum.
That may be, but this grinding conflict continues to exact a terrible price. Paul Adams, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, let's go live now to our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, in Kyiv. Paul, we understand that the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken spent the night there in Kyiv as part of his 2-day visit to the country, and the US has announced a new military support package for Ukraine, including controversial tank shells. Tell us a bit more about these.
Well, I think you're referring to the depleted uranium shells which are being provided. Not the first country to provide them. Britain has already provided some of those. There has been controversy in the past about them because there is an allegation, which Moscow has repeated in the last couple of days, that they spread radiation and pose a kind of nuclear danger. Most scientific experts say that that is simply not the case. They've been used in other conflicts around the world. There's no evidence to suggest that they have had that kind of effect. What they are is highly effective in penetrating armour. So as a weapon against other armoured vehicles, they are extremely useful, and that is why I think the Americans have decided to supply them. It is part of a much wider package, not just of military assistance, but a lot of other assistance too. In fact, the bulk of yesterday's announcement was not military assistance at all. It was a range of other things, including economic assistance. Interestingly, there was a first in there, around $4 or $5 million of frozen Russian assets, frozen from Russian oligarchs, now being given to Ukraine to help pay for the cost of rehabilitation of some of Ukraine's veterans. I think that may be the first time that frozen assets have been used in that way. And Mr. Blinken, when he was presenting this package yesterday, made it clear that this was in part about making sure that Ukraine could maintain the momentum in its offensive in the south, but also about thinking about Ukraine's future.
And what else do we hear from the Secretary of State? Obviously, his visit is significant because it's coming in the midst of Ukraine's counteroffensive operation, as you mentioned there, Paul.
Yeah, so this did come at a time when, voices have been raised in the United States, generally unattributed comments in American newspapers suggesting that there was criticism of the way Ukraine was conducting its offensive, that it was going too slowly, that it wouldn't be likely to achieve its objectives by the end of this year. I think Mr. Blinken was keen to present a very different, or strike a very different tone yesterday. He was briefed, obviously, by Ukrainian officials, including the President Zelensky, who's been himself down to the front in recent days to talk to troops there. And the message that Mr. Blinken came out with at the end was that progress was real, it was heartening, and that American assistance would be there to make sure that the momentum could be kept up. If you look at the map of what has changed in the south in recent days. You've got to look pretty closely to see the changes, but they are real and they do constitute, in the belief of Ukrainian officials, a breakthrough which could result in an acceleration of their campaign. And so I think Mr. Blinken was keen to recognise that and to strike this positive note.